They found the child by accident, buried deep beneath the jagged cliffs of Alaris 9, inside the rusted shell of a downed transport. A salvage crew stumbled across the impossible. A human child, barely 10 years old, curled up and asleep inside a cryopod that hadn't seen light in over a century. The pod hissed open with a sigh, like the world itself was exhaling after holding its breath far too long. No identification, no beacon, no signal. Just a child, alone, silent, eyes wide with a fear that ran deeper than the cold. The universe had forgotten Earth long ago, or maybe it had been erased, not by war or disaster, but by time and silence. Humanity had vanished from the galactic records, stories of its rise and fall reduced to myths, shared in smoky cantinas and dusty archives. But now, here was living proof that Earth had existed, that somewhere, somehow, a remnant of its legacy had survived. The crew didn't know what to do. This wasn't cargo. This wasn't salvage. This was a living piece of history. Some wanted to report it to the Intergalactic Assembly. Others argued it should be kept hidden. Knowledge like this could shift power, reignite old alliances, or worse, awaken enemies who remembered Earth for its defiance. The child said little at first, just stared out at the stars, as if trying to recognize constellations that no longer existed. But strange things began to happen. The ship's old tech systems, outdated and barely functional, responded to the child's presence, sparking to life in ways they hadn't in years. The navigation core rerouted itself. Lights flickered. Engines hummed at a new frequency. And then came the voice, not from the child, but from the ship itself. A low, fractured whisper, like someone speaking across centuries. Directive found. Legacy protocol initiated. The crew tried to override it, but the ship wouldn't listen anymore. Charts began drawing themselves. Coordinates pulsed in ancient code. Symbols none of them had seen before except one. A forgotten emblem that hadn't been used in generations. The insignia of the Terran expansion fleet. It was like history clawing its way back from the void. The child began to change too. Not physically, but something inside them was waking up. Memories that weren't theirs. Words and languages no one had spoken in 100 years. Dreams of places that hadn't existed in centuries. As if the pod hadn't just preserved them, but programmed them. Some on the crew whispered about human experiments, about Earth's desperation in its final days. Others believed something darker had been buried with the past. Something meant to stay forgotten. They set course for the coordinates, though no one admitted out loud why. Curiosity. Duty? Fear. The child stood on the bridge, eyes locked on the stars. No longer afraid. No longer silent. And then the ship stopped, dead in space. Engines cut, power drained, as if something had reached out and grabbed it. Outside, in the void, something massive was waiting. The stars outside flickered unnaturally, like they were being swallowed one by one. The crew stood frozen on the bridge, staring at the shape looming ahead. Black against black, not reflecting light, just absorbing it. No readings came through. No signals. It was as if the sensors couldn't even agree that it was really there. But it was. They could feel it. Like a weight pressing against the hull, against their bones. The child moved first, walking slowly toward the viewport. The way they stared at that thing, it wasn't shock. It wasn't even fear. It was recognition. The captain, a grizzled woman with half her face replaced by synth plates, tried to restart the engines, barking orders with rising panic. Nothing responded. Systems refused to obey. The emergency thrusters, the shields, even life support, locked in standby. The ship wasn't broken. It was waiting. Back in the main hold, they uncovered more hidden tech in the cryopod's compartment. Old Earth designs. Military grade, embedded deep in the walls like backup systems. Symbols stamped on them, not in any modern tongue, but pre-assembly human script. Latin. Below the wires, someone had etched a warning. He is not alone. Questions stacked up faster than answers. Who had placed the child in that pod? What had they been fleeing from? Or sent toward? And why now, after all this time, was the universe suddenly responding? The child, still silent, finally looked at the crew, like really looked at them, and said just one thing. "It's not here for me. It's here because I woke up." That sent chills through the room. They had all assumed the child was the key, a relic, a lost soul with forgotten knowledge. But what if they were something more? A trigger, a message. Then came the knock. Not on the hull, no sound could carry in space, but it was felt deep inside the ship, like the vibration of a heartbeat that wasn't human. It pulsed through the floor, through the walls, and into their bodies. Lights dimmed. A low hum built up, steady, unrelenting. The ship's AI flickered back online, but it wasn't the voice they knew. It was older, more formal, like a teacher waking from a long slumber. Legacy vessel Aeneid class, recognized. Human signature verified. Contingency protocol. Exodus echo engaged. The ship began to move, not under their control. It rotated toward the black shape in the void. It wasn't a ship, at least not like any they knew. It had no engines, no markings, just a structure, vast, ancient, still, waiting. Its surface began to shimmer, not with light, but with memory. Flashes of earth, oceans, forests, cities that hadn't stood in 1,000 years, and behind it all, war, fire in orbit, humanity's last breath scattered across the stars. The crew watched in silence, the images reflected in their wide, terrified eyes. The child stepped forward again, closer to the screen. "That's where it started," they whispered. The captain turned, voice tight. "Where what started?" The child didn't answer, because something was knocking again, louder this time, closer, from inside the ship. The crew scattered, weapons drawn. Not that any of their gear could be trusted to work against whatever was moving inside the ship. The knocking had rhythm now, not random, like it was following a pattern, or maybe a language. Every clang against the metal rang through their nerves. The walls themselves felt tighter, like the ship was breathing. Slow, heavy, with something caught in its lungs. They searched the corridors in silence, communication down to whispers and hand signals. No one said it out loud, but they all felt it. They weren't alone on the ship anymore. The child stayed on the bridge, still staring at the void beyond the glass. Not afraid, just waiting. The lights above them buzzed with static, flickering like they were fighting to stay lit. Down in the maintenance corridor, one of the engineers found something behind a panel. Not a creature, not even a person. A mark, scratched into the wall. A circle with lines running through it, intersecting at strange angles. It pulsed faintly, like it had its own heartbeat. No one knew what it meant, but the child did. When they saw the image on the console, they spoke again, only this time, not in the crew's language. It was ancient, and the ship answered. That's when the door to the cryopod bay sealed itself shut. Locked tight. Emergency overrides dead. One of the crew was still inside, and when they tried to cut through, the walls screamed, a sound not made for ears. The captain tried to pull everyone back, to regroup, but the crew was splitting. Fear does that. One wanted to jettison the child. Another wanted to hand them over to the assembly, claim some reward. Only a few still believed the kid was human. The child listened quietly to the arguing, then said, calmly, "It's waking up." Nobody asked what it was. In the records room, buried under layers of dust and forgotten files, they found part of the puzzle. A hidden data core, decades older than the ship itself. It had been added long after the vessel was decommissioned. They pulled it out, hooked it to the nav systems. The logs were encrypted, but one thing got through. A transmission fragment from Earth, time-stamped just before the collapse. It was a warning, not to run, not to fight. Just a simple command. Preserve the legacy. Do not awaken the cradle. No one knew what the cradle was, but the ship did. Coordinates were routed, engines powered back on. The black shape outside was no longer still. It began to open, and across the void, a signal broadcast, not to the ship, not to the crew, but straight to the child. The language wasn't just sound. It was memory, images, feelings, fire and sorrow, a sky burning, a people betrayed by their own creation, and one final attempt to bury it all, deep in space, behind locked doors and long-dead warnings. On the bridge, the child whispered something under their breath, not in fear, not in wonder, in apology. The black structure began pulling them in, and from the sealed cryopod bay, someone, or something, finally answered the knock. The ship's engines hummed to life with a violent jerk, throwing everyone off balance. The child, who had been standing perfectly still, suddenly turned toward the viewport, eyes wide. They weren't looking at the black structure anymore. They were looking at something else, something coming from inside the ship. The crew rushed to the command center, but the lights flickered again, more erratically now, like the pulse of something alive. The walls of the ship seemed to shift, bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The corridors twisted, expanded, contracted, an impossible, living maze. Some of the crew were already screaming, trying to make their way back to the hold, but the doors shut before they could reach them. Their calls for help came in garbled static over the comms, cutting off like the ship itself was swallowing their words. The knocking grew louder, closer. And then there was a screech. Not metal against metal, but something deeper, something primal. The ship's hull shuddered violently, as though something was pushing from the inside. And suddenly, from somewhere deep below, a massive thud echoed. A sound like a heavy weight hitting the ground, followed by the unmistakable sound of scraping, like claws dragging against metal. The crew didn't need to ask what it was. They knew. Something had awakened. The captain slammed her fist against the console, trying to regain control. But the ship was already moving toward the dark shape outside, slowly, purposefully. Every time she tried to override the controls, they failed, as though the ship itself was fighting her. The child, still standing there, remained calm, as if they were in tune with what was happening. "It's too late," they said softly. The cradle was never meant to sleep. "What are you talking about?" the captain demanded, fear creeping into her voice. But the child just shook their head. "You won't understand. No one does. That's why we were sent." The walls vibrated again, this time with a terrifying force, and the scraping grew louder. Something was moving through the ship now, tearing through the metal and making its way toward them. It was no longer a sound. It was a presence, shifting in the dark spaces, an unknown creature that had been here longer than any of them realized. The crew started to scatter, some toward weapons lockers, others toward escape pods. But no matter where they turned, the doors wouldn't open. The ship was locking them in. There was nowhere to run. One of the crew members, a young technician, tried to pry open a maintenance hatch, desperate to find a way out. But just as their hands touched the panel, the floor beneath them cracked with a sudden explosion of force, throwing them backward. A long, spindly arm shot through the rupture, and the technician's scream was cut short as they were dragged into the dark. The child stood motionless, watching the chaos unfold, as if they were waiting for something. "You have to understand. This isn't just a ship, it's a prison. And we're all inside it." Outside the viewport, the black structure began to unfurl like an ancient, decaying flower. The edges shimmered as though some immense force was pulling it apart, revealing an enormous silhouette, the shape of something vast, incomprehensible, something that shouldn't have existed. But it did, and it was coming toward them. The ship groaned as it lurched forward, drawn into the gravitational pull of whatever force was ahead. The crew, scattered and confused, could only look on in horror as the last of the lights flickered out, leaving them in total darkness. The knocking grew louder again, But it was no longer outside. It was inside the ship. Something was inside them, inside the walls. The captain turned to the child, her voice desperate. "What is it? What do we do?" The child finally looked away from the viewport, their eyes filled with an ancient sorrow. "We wake it." And in that moment, the scraping stopped. The knocking ceased. Then came the voice. A whisper at first, then louder, resonating through every inch of the ship. "Time's up." And the darkness closed in. The voice echoed through the ship again, deeper now, as if it was coming from the very walls themselves. "Time's up." The child stood still, unblinking, their gaze locked on the blackness beyond the viewport. The ship trembled as if the very fabric of reality was bending around it, and in that moment, everything became clear. The ship was no longer a vessel. It was a prison. A place meant to keep something locked away, something that had never truly been contained. And now, it was waking up. The captain's hand shook as she reached for the controls once more, but the ship was no longer hers to command. It had become something else. A conduit, a gateway. And she realized, too late, that this had never been about survival. It had always been about the child. The key, the legacy. "Why?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The child didn't respond at first. They simply stared at the growing shape outside the viewport, something massive, its features shifting, not quite tangible. Then, with a sad sigh, they spoke softly, as if revealing a painful truth. Humanity didn't fall. It was erased. A decision was made, and Earth was forgotten. We were meant to be the last memory, the last chance to keep what we built alive. But that decision wasn't ours to make. The walls seemed to bend in closer, and the knocking started again. Faster, more frantic. Whatever was inside the ship, or perhaps inside them, had been waiting too long. Waiting for the right moment, the right signal. The captain's breath caught in her throat. She understood now. The child wasn't the trigger. The child was the last legacy of Earth, the one thing that could awaken what had been buried. The cradle. It wasn't a place. It wasn't a thing. It was a mind. A consciousness from humanity's past, buried deep, twisted by time and forgotten knowledge. It spoke again, louder this time. The cradle stirs. Your history ends, and a new beginning is forged. The ship's structure groaned, and with a violent crash, the ceiling above them split open. A towering form emerged from the dark, not quite humanoid, but undeniably alive. It was a relic from Earth, not of flesh, but of metal, bone, and something far older. Its eyes flickered with 1,000 years of lost knowledge, and it was here, now, to reclaim what had been hidden for far too long. The child turned one last time, their expression filled with a strange, almost resigned calm. "I'm sorry," they said softly, as though apologizing for a fate they couldn't control. "You should have never come here." The creature reached out, its massive hand extending toward the crew, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. The captain stood frozen, knowing there was no escape. The ship, the cradle, the legacy, it was all coming to a head. And then, with a roar that shook the very foundation of the ship, the creature's hand closed around them all. The silence that followed was deafening. There was no more knocking, no more sound at all. The ship drifted, alone in the vast emptiness of space, its purpose fulfilled. The cradle had been awakened, its long slumber over. And as the stars outside flickered, something shifted within the ship. The legacy of Earth had not been destroyed. It had simply been reborn. In the end, the child wasn't just the key. They were the final chapter of a story that had been written in the stars long before any of them were born. Humanity, in its greatest hour, had left behind a legacy it could not be erased. Not even by time. Not even by the darkness of space. It would live on. Forever. And as the ship drifted, slowly fading into the unknown, the last thing left behind was a single faint whisper. "It's time for the stars to remember."